By the time the battered saloon rolled up on the side of the road, its exhaust sputtering in the damp air, I didn't hesitate. The driver was a wiry guy in his 40s, clean-shaven but with deep creases around his mouth and eyes. His hair was a little too neat for someone driving a car that old. It smelled faintly of petrol inside, the fabric seats worn and stained in places. I dumped my bag in the footwell and buckled in. We hadn't been driving long when I noticed the glove compartment. It wasn't the compartment itself that drew my attention, but the driver's eyes. He glanced towards it every few minutes, quick and sharp, as though checking it hadn't sprung open of its own accord. His movements were slight, almost imperceptible, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. The car's heater was on the fritz, so the air had that clammy feel you get when it's too cold to be comfortable, but too warm for a jacket. The windows fogged slightly at the edges, giving the world outside a muted, blurred quality. The trees lining the road flickered past like a broken reel of film. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, knuckles pale, but every so often his gaze flicked sideways again. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe it was just old papers in there, receipts, the kind of junk that piles up in cars. Still, I couldn't shake the odd prickling at the base of my neck, the way my stomach knotted when his glance lingered a fraction too long. The journey dragged on, the countryside giving way to grey industrial estates, then back to farmland. We hadn't spoken much. He wasn't the chatty type, and I wasn't inclined to start. It was around the fourth or fifth glance at the glove compartment that he said we needed petrol. He pulled into a station at the edge of a small village, one of those places where the shop looks like it hasn't seen a lick of paint in decades. He killed the engine and climbed out without a word, heading towards the kiosk. For a moment, I stayed where I was, my fingers tapping aimlessly against my knee. The glove compartment was just there, inches away. It was locked, but the lock itself was flimsy, a little latch you could probably force open with a screwdriver. I hesitated. Then my hand moved almost on its own, pulling at the edge of the latch. To my surprise, it gave with a faint snap, the compartment dropping open. Inside was a mess of papers, maps, and a few crumpled packets of mints. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention. Tucked beneath the papers was something metallic. My breath hitched as I reached in and pulled it free. It was a knife, long and slender, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. The handle was wrapped in tape, worn and fraying at the edges. And then there was the photo. It was creased and yellowed at the edges, a Polaroid of a girl no older than 20. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on something out of frame. There was a smudge of dirt across her cheek, and her expression, I couldn't pin it down. Fear, maybe, or something worse. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped so hard I nearly dropped the knife. My heart hammered as I shoved the photo back into the compartment and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled with the latch, trying to make it look untouched, but the lock wouldn't click back into place. I turned just as he slid into the driver's seat, his eyes immediately landing on me. He didn't say anything, just looked. His gaze drifted towards the glove compartment, then back to me. The engine sputtered to life and the car pulled back onto the road. My palms were sweating, the knife still hidden under my jacket where I'd shoved it in panic. I tried to keep my breathing steady, my eyes fixed on the trees, blurring past the window. His gaze flicked between me and the road, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the wheel with a force that made the skin stretch taut. I wanted to get out, but the car was moving too fast. My mind raced, thinking of excuses, of ways to end this without tipping him off. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel now, and the air inside the car felt colder than before. The glove compartment hung slightly ajar, the latch still broken. His eyes met mine. I was driving through the Midlands, the kind of stretch where the radio crackles with static and the road seems to stretch endlessly ahead, grey and unremarkable. My goal was Scotland, though I hadn't planned a direct route. Driving kept my mind off things, off the pile of unpaid bills at home, off the muffled arguments with my landlord. I figured I'd take the back roads, the quieter ones, and let the countryside swallow me up for a bit. The sun was low, casting long streaks of light across the tarmac. As I rolled up to an exit ramp, I saw her standing there. She was small, bundled in a beige coat that hung loosely around her shoulders, a duffel bag at her feet. Her hand was out, thumb up in that universal signal. I hesitated for just a moment before pulling over. The air in the car changed as she climbed in. She had a stillness about her, an economy of movement that made her seem older than she probably was. Her bag ended up wedged at her feet and she settled in without much fuss. We drove in silence for a while, the miles ticking by. I was glad for the company, even if she didn't seem much for conversation. I wasn't either, to be fair. The road curled and twisted through empty farmland and the occasional pocket of woodland, the light fading to dusk. Then she started talking. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of tone you use when recounting something factual. She said this road had a history, that people had disappeared along it. I nodded along, trying to keep my focus on the winding road. Everyone had stories like that about their local patch of countryside. People went missing everywhere, didn't they? It wasn't as though this place was special. But she kept going. Her words had an odd precision to them. She mentioned a couple, young and on their way back from a wedding, who had stopped when their car broke down near mile marker 84. Their bodies were found days later in the woods, tied to separate trees, faces covered. A delivery driver who'd gone missing during his overnight shift, his van abandoned just off a narrow dirt track. She described it all so clearly, too clearly. I gripped the wheel tighter, my palms were damp, and I kept my eyes on the road, avoiding her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her tone didn't waver as she talked, each story sliding seamlessly into the next. A girl, only 16, who had been walking home late one night when she vanished. Her shoes had been found by the side of this road, neatly placed as though she'd taken them off herself. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. She might have read about these cases in the papers or heard them from locals, but her voice stayed calm, as though she was reading from a list she knew by heart. I glanced at her briefly. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her face turned towards the passenger window. She looked almost serene, as though the things she was describing had nothing to do with her at all. Then she mentioned a man in his 30s driving alone, someone who'd picked up a hitchhiker on this exact stretch of road. He'd never reached his destination. His car was found abandoned a week later, parked just off the shoulder, keys still in the ignition. No sign of him, no sign of the hitchhiker. My chest felt tight. I didn't say anything, just kept driving. The air felt colder in the car now, though I hadn't touched the controls. Her words seemed to fill the space, heavy and unshakable. My thoughts spiraled, tangling together in a mess of doubt and dread. How did she know all this? Why was she telling me? The road ahead blurred slightly as I fought to keep my focus. My hands ached from gripping the wheel too tightly. The trees on either side of us loomed higher, the gaps between them growing smaller. I spotted a lay-by up ahead, one of those dirt patches where lorry drivers sometimes stop to rest. My mind raced, weighing my options. Should I pull over? Should I keep driving and hope she asked to get out soon? The thought of stopping churned my stomach, but so did the idea of staying on the road with her. I stole another glance at her. She hadn't moved, still staring out the window as though the stories she'd just recounted weren't rattling through my head like loose stones in a tin can. The silence between us grew louder. I noticed the faintest movement, her hand brushing the edge of her duffel bag. The lay-by was coming up fast. I made a split-second decision and pulled off the road, the tires kicking up gravel. The engine idled as I sat there, the headlights cutting a pale swath through the growing darkness. She didn't move. For a moment, neither did I. When I finally turned to look at her, she was already opening the door, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She stepped out onto the gravel without a glance back, walking towards the trees. The car door swung shut behind her, the sound sharp and final. I sat there, gripping the wheel, the engine still running. My eyes followed her as she disappeared into the woods, her pale coat blending into the gloom. The stillness of the lay-by pressed against my ears, thick and impenetrable. I waited, straining to hear any sound, a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves. But there was nothing. I don't know how long I stayed there before I put the car back into gear and drove away. When I glanced into the rearview mirror, the road behind me was empty. The afternoon sun was low, blinding in its glare, and I'd been on the side of the road for hours, my thumb out, shoes scuffed from pacing the hard shoulder. The driver leaned out the window and gave a wave. He was middle-aged, maybe older, with a ruddy face and thinning hair under a faded cap. He looked ordinary, like someone's uncle who might work in a garage or fix fences for a living. The truck itself was an old pickup, paint peeling around the edges and dust caking the wheels. The bed was empty except for a couple of bungee cords and what looked like a folded tarp tucked into one corner. It was the sort of vehicle you didn't think twice about, a working man's truck. He gestured for me to hop in, and I didn't hesitate. The cab smelled faintly of engine oil and stale tobacco. It was warmer than I expected, the air thick with the remnants of whatever he'd been eating earlier. He had a thermos wedged between the seats and an empty sandwich wrapper crumpled on the dashboard. As we started moving, he drummed his fingers on the wheel, the engine growling as he picked up speed. I tried not to stare, but couldn't help glancing over now and then. His hands were calloused, his knuckles darkened as though he spent his days working outdoors. The journey was fine at first. We passed long stretches of fields, the occasional hedgerow or farmhouse breaking the monotony. I didn't have much on me, just a small backpack with some essentials and a jacket tied around my waist. The driver didn't seem to mind me being there. Every so often he'd glance in my direction, his smile easy, his eyes squinting slightly in the sunlight. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual. We drove like that for maybe 30 minutes before he mentioned needing to pull over. The fuel gauge was low and the next services weren't for miles. He turned onto a narrow road that wound through a stretch of forest. The trees rose high on either side, their bare branches clawing at the sky. It felt colder here, even though the sun was still out. He parked in a clearing, gravel crunching under the tires. The truck shuddered to a halt, and he hopped out without a word, heading towards the trees. I stayed put for a moment, unsure whether I should stretch my legs or stay in the cab. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I slid out onto the ground. The clearing was quiet, too quiet, really. The trees seemed to absorb the sounds of the world, muting everything into a dull silence. I wandered to the back of the truck, thinking I might as well check my pack while I waited. That's when I noticed it. The tarp in the truck bed wasn't folded neatly like I'd thought. It was scrunched into the corner, the edges frayed and dirty. There was a smear on it, dark and reddish-brown. Nearby, a coil of rope lay tangled, its strands stiff and stained in places. My stomach twisted as I looked closer, my brain scrambling to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was a hunter or a farmer. Maybe he used the truck for hauling something. I tried not to let my mind go to darker places, but it was hard not to. I stepped back, heart thudding, and turned towards the trees. He was still out of sight. The clearing felt bigger now, the truck suddenly too small, too exposed. I looked around, my pulse racing, and tried to act casual as I climbed back into the cab. The seat was cold under me, and the silence felt even heavier than before. When he returned, his boots crunching across the gravel, I tried not to meet his eyes. He didn't say anything as he climbed back into the driver's seat, but his expression had shifted. His smile was still there, but it was tighter now, his lips pressed thin. He started the engine, and we pulled back onto the road. We didn't head towards the motorway. The narrow road twisted deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their trunks looming like sentinels. I gripped my backpack tighter, my mind racing with excuses to leave. I thought about asking him to stop, but the words felt stuck in my throat. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, his eyes fixed ahead. After a while, the truck slowed, the gravel under the tires grinding louder as we came to a stop in another clearing. This one was smaller, the trees pressing in closer, their branches arching overhead. He cut the engine and turned to look at me. His smile was gone. He climbed out, walking to the back of the truck. I stayed frozen in my seat, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. I heard him unhooking the tarp, the faint scrape of metal on metal as he worked. My hand fumbled for the door handle, fingers trembling, but I couldn't seem to make myself move. When he returned, his hands were empty. He stood there for a moment, staring at me through the window. His expression was blank now, as though he were sizing me up, weighing some decision in his head. Then he opened the door. I don't remember much after that. The last thing I saw was the forest blurring around me as he dragged me from the cab, my backpack slipping from my grip. The tarp was still in the bed of the truck, its edges smeared with dark stains. It wasn't meant to be a big deal. Greg and I had set out for a weekend trip to the Lake District, just two mates getting away from it all. We didn't account for the car breaking down on that stretch of road, the one that seemed to go on forever, flanked by bare fields and the occasional clump of trees, the kind of road that swallows sound and stretches the sky so wide it makes you feel small. We stood there for what felt like ages, waving our arms like idiots whenever a car passed. A few slowed down, but none stopped. When the battered red pickup finally pulled over, it was a relief. The driver leaned out, smiling wide enough to show his yellowing teeth. He was older, with a face cracked like leather and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He gestured us to hop in. The cab smelled faintly of sweat and motor oil, but it was better than freezing on the roadside. He was chatty, though. His voice had a sharpness that put me on edge. I chalked it up to my mood. I was tired and hungry, and Greg kept elbowing me in the ribs whenever I looked like I wasn't paying attention. The man had a cooler wedged between the seats, and after a while, he offered us each a drink. Greg was quick to take one, and I followed his lead. It was soda, something sugary and fizzy that burned a bit going down. I drank fast, hoping it would keep me awake. It didn't. The world began to sway like I was on a boat in rough water. My head lolled back, the edges of my vision blurring. I could see Greg slumping too, his face slack, his arm dangling between the seats. The driver glanced at me, his grin now more like a sneer. His teeth looked sharper somehow. When I came to, it was dark, the kind of dark that presses in from every direction. The truck was still moving, bumping over uneven ground. I could hear the crunch of tires on gravel or dirt. My body felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely mine. I couldn't lift my arms, couldn't even wiggle my fingers. The only part of me that obeyed was my head, which turned, just enough for me to see that Greg was gone. The driver was still there, his hands gripping the wheel. His shoulders moved slightly, like he was chuckling to himself. I couldn't make out much beyond the cab's dim interior. The cooler was gone, the dashboard light casting faint shadows. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt swollen and useless. My throat burned and my breath came shallow and fast. My mind screamed, but my body remained limp. The truck lurched to a stop. I heard the metallic creak of the door opening, then the muffled thud of boots hitting the ground. He stepped away, disappearing into the blackness. I couldn't see where we were, but the air smelled damp, earthy. I strained to listen, hoping to catch a sound, anything that might explain what was happening. There was nothing but silence. I tried to move again, forcing every ounce of willpower into my arms, my legs. Something shifted, just my fingers twitching, but it was enough to spark a flicker of hope. My eyes darted around the cab, searching for a clue, a weapon, a way out. The key was still in the ignition, but my body was as useless as a bag of stones. The driver came back. I didn't hear him until the door opened, flooding the cab with cold night air. He climbed in, his movements slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. His eyes flicked to me and his grin returned, wider this time. He didn't say a word, just started the truck and drove on. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he left Greg somewhere? Was he coming back for him later? Or had he already... No, I couldn't think about that. I wouldn't. I focused on the rhythm of the road, the uneven hum of the engine, trying to keep myself anchored. My head lolled again and the darkness pressed in. When I woke, the truck was parked in a clearing surrounded by trees. The headlights were off, but the faint glow of the moon lit the area. I could make out shapes, a tree stump, a pile of logs, and something else, something that looked like a mound of earth. Though it was hard to tell in the dim light. The driver was outside again, standing near the mound. He had something in his hand, something long and thin that gleamed faintly. He moved with purpose, crouching near the mound, then straightening up. My chest tightened as I realized what I was seeing. The mound wasn't just earth. There was fabric sticking out, torn and dirty, and a hand. Greg's hand. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate, my lungs seizing as my mind spiraled into panic. The driver turned, his eyes catching the faint moonlight as he looked straight at me. That grin spread across his face again, and he took a step toward the truck. I still couldn't move. The door opened, and his hand reached in. I felt his fingers close around my arm, rough and calloused, pulling me towards him. My vision blurred, and my head swam as the world tilted sideways. He dragged me out of the cab. The cool night air biting at my skin, my legs trailed uselessly behind me, the ground scraping against my jeans. I caught one last glimpse of Greg's hand as the driver hauled me past the mound, his laughter ringing in my ears. I remember the moment I accepted the ride. It was late, and the trains had stopped running. I was in a quiet part of town. I'd spent all my cash earlier and didn't fancy walking miles back to my flat. So when the car pulled up, a neat little hatchback with a friendly-looking couple inside, I hesitated only for a second before stepping towards it. The man behind the wheel looked like someone's dad with greying hair and a warm smile. His wife, or at least I assumed she was his wife, had that motherly air, wearing a cardigan even though it was July. They offered a lift, their voices kind and reasonable. They even asked where I was heading. I told them the name of my building, and they nodded like they knew it. I wasn't drunk, but I'd had just enough to ignore the faint prickle of hesitation that ran down my spine. They didn't look like trouble. I climbed into the back seat, feeling the synthetic upholstery stick a little to my forearms. The ride started off as you'd expect. The man asked about my studies, his wife chiming in occasionally. She handed back a bottle of water, unopened, and I drank it. I thought about texting my flatmate to say I'd be back soon, but figured it wasn't necessary. I sat back and let the hum of the engine and the soft murmur of the radio lull me into a kind of calm. It wasn't until I glanced out the window that I noticed the streets seemed unfamiliar. At first I chalked it up to being tired or tipsy, but then I caught a glimpse of the GPS on the dashboard. The route was highlighted in blue, a line snaking through the map, but it wasn't taking us towards my building. I cleared my throat, shifting in my seat, but I didn't say anything. The woman turned slightly as if sensing my discomfort, and explained they were taking a shortcut. I nodded, though I didn't remember there being one. Still, I stayed quiet. It felt awkward to challenge them, especially when they were doing me a favor. But my gaze kept flicking to the GPS, where the arrival time seemed to stretch further and further into the night. The houses outside thinned until there were none, replaced by fields edged with low broken fences. I tried to tell myself this was fine, just a detour, but my pulse was picking up. I sat forward, clutching the edge of the seat, and stared at the road ahead. It curved into the distance, hemmed in by hedgerows that rose higher than the car windows. The couple stopped chatting. The radio was still on, a faint crackle over some old tune, but neither of them spoke. The man's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. His wife sat very still, her face turned forward, her expression blank. My throat dried as I glanced back at the GPS. The blue line now ended at a location I didn't recognize, somewhere remote, somewhere I didn't want to be. The urge to say something pressed against me like a tidal wave, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. The longer I stayed silent, the harder it became. The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. Something in her gaze sent a chill coursing through me. Not anger, not malice, just calm. Too calm. When the car slowed, my heart leapt. We were on a narrow road, the fields replaced by thick woods pressing close on either side. The GPS screen flickered briefly before reloading, the route unchanged. I'd tried the door handle, but it didn't budge. The locks were on. I glanced up, catching the faint twitch of the man's lips, not quite a smile. The car stopped completely. The engine ticked as it cooled, the headlights throwing pale light onto the dirt track ahead. I tried to make sense of the situation, to figure out what they wanted. But my mind kept looping back to the locked doors. The woman got out first. She moved briskly, walking around to the back of the car. I craned my neck, trying to see what she was doing, but my view was blocked. The man stayed in his seat, staring straight ahead. The silence pressed down on me, except for the faint click of the boot opening. When she returned, she was holding something, though I couldn't make out what it was. She opened the rear passenger door and the cool night air rushed in, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. I pressed myself back against the seat, my mind scrambling for a plan. My legs felt like lead, my breathing too loud in the stillness. She leaned in, her face close to mine, and I noticed a faint sheen of sweat on her brow despite the cool air. She didn't say anything, just reached for the bottle of water I'd placed in the cup holder. For a moment I thought that was all she wanted, but then her other hand darted forward, grabbing my arm. I yanked it back instinctively, my elbow slamming against the window. She didn't flinch, her grip like iron. I tried to kick, to twist away, but the man turned then, his eyes locking onto mine, and my movements faltered. There was nothing in his expression, not anger, not urgency, just a steady, unflinching calm. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees too close, the air too still. My brain screamed at me to run, but the door was still locked, and her grip didn't loosen. She pulled, and I slid towards the open door despite myself, my shoes scraping against the floor of the car. And then I was outside, my feet sinking into soft earth, the trees towering above me. The man got out as well, shutting his door with a quiet click. They stood on either side of me, their faces blank, their movements measured. I don't know what I expected, some kind of explanation, maybe even a demand, but nothing came. They just stood there, the woman still clutching the bottle of water, her other hand flexing like she was testing its strength. The man tilted his head slightly, as if listening for something far away, and then he took a step forward. I don't remember running, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was crashing through the trees, branches scratching at my face, my legs pounding against the uneven ground. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if they were following. That's where my memory ends. When I woke up, it was daylight, and I was lying on the edge of a field, my clothes torn and my arms covered in scratches. I didn't have my phone, my wallet, or even my shoes. The police didn't find anything. No car, no couple, no evidence at all. The rain was hammering down in sheets when I saw him, a lone figure at the side of the road, clutching a piece of soggy cardboard. I nearly didn't stop. I mean, who picks up hitchhikers these days? But he looked desperate, his coat clinging to his frame like it had given up keeping him dry long ago. His sign was too wet to read, but the pleading look he threw my way as I slowed told me enough. I flicked on the hazards and leaned over to pop the passenger door. The man climbed in, dragging a damp smell with him. Water pooled around his boots, and I glanced at the mess he was making of my car's interior. He muttered something that sounded like thanks, though he didn't meet my eyes. We pulled away, tires slicing through the standing water on the tarmac. I kept the radio off, the silence broken only by the swish of the wipers and the occasional slosh as we hit a puddle. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, and he didn't seem eager to chat either. That suited me just fine. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark save for the twin beams of my headlights. I'd always hated driving in weather like this. The water blurred everything, turned familiar shapes into vague outlines. It wasn't long before I regretted stopping for him. His presence filled the car like the damp, and the silence wasn't companionable. It pressed on my ears, sharp and uncomfortable. I stole glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. He sat stiffly, hands on his knees staring straight ahead. His clothes looked like they'd been through a hedge twice. Mud streaked his trousers, and his shirt had a tear near the collar. I thought of asking what had happened to him, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he didn't seem interested in explaining. We drove on. The rain didn't let up, hammering the roof like a frantic drummer. Trees lined the road, their branches forming jagged outlines against the murky sky. It was the kind of route that felt cut off from the rest of the world. No streetlights, no houses, just darkness, rolling hills, and the occasional road sign pointing to places I'd never heard of. After what felt like an eternity, he shifted in his seat. I didn't look, but I could feel it. The change in his posture, like he'd suddenly remembered he wasn't alone. When he finally spoke, his voice startled me. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin like a knife through butter. He said people were too trusting these days, that it was dangerous to stop for strangers. My grip on the wheel tightened. I told myself he was making conversation, trying to fill the awkward quiet. But the words didn't feel casual. There was something in the way he said it, something that raised the hairs on my arms. I glanced at him again. He was staring at me now, his face pale in the dashboard's glow. I couldn't read his expression. His eyes looked too bright, though, like he'd been out in the cold too long. He started talking about how easy it was to fool people. How a bit of mud on your clothes and a sad face could open doors. Or car doors, as it turned out. He laughed then, low and sudden, and I almost jumped. The sound didn't suit him. It was too loud for the small space, too sharp for the otherwise muted drive. I didn't know what to say. My tongue felt thick in my mouth and my pulse thudded in my ears. The rain was relentless. The road seemed narrower and my headlights barely pushed back the darkness. I could feel him watching me. Not with his eyes, but in the way his words hung in the air, in the way he'd shifted in his seat to face me more directly. He started listing things, ways to gain someone's trust, lies you could tell to get them to let you in. It felt like he was talking to himself more than me, but every word landed like a weight in my chest. My hands were clammy on the wheel, and I realized I'd slowed down. The thought of pulling over flashed through my mind, but the thought of stopping was worse. The road ahead twisted sharply, and I took the curve too fast. The tires squealed, and the car shuddered before straightening out. He didn't seem fazed. He leaned back in his seat, looking almost relaxed now, as if he just needed to get something off his chest. I wished he'd stopped talking, but he didn't. His voice was steady as he described scenarios that sounded like they'd come from some cheap crime novel, but the way he spoke, it didn't feel like fiction. I tried to focus on the road, but his words had burrowed into my mind. I thought about how remote this stretch of road was, how unlikely it was that anyone would come along if something happened. The rain muffled everything outside the car. The darkness felt absolute. He stopped talking abruptly. I glanced at him, expecting, I don't know what. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back against the seat. He looked asleep. Relief flooded me, though it didn't make sense. My hands trembled on the wheel. I'd never felt so tense in my life. I kept driving, unsure of what I'd do when we reached a town. The rain started to let up. The world outside the car becoming clearer. I dared to relax a fraction. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, but didn't open his eyes. I thought about turning on the radio, anything to break the silence, but I didn't. When the headlights caught the shape in the road ahead, my heart leapt into my throat. It looked like another figure standing perfectly still, their back to us. As we approached, I realized they weren't standing. They were sitting, cross-legged, directly in the middle of the lane, no reflective clothing, no sign of a car nearby, just sitting there. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop. My heart was hammering. The figure didn't move. The hitchhiker stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open. He didn't look surprised, he didn't look concerned. He just smiled.